Okay, we're going to get started here. Welcome, everybody, to the March OWASP Austin chapter meeting. Welcome. Everybody having a good time so far? Enjoying the weather? Today, our sponsors are for the food is sponsored by our LastCon conference, and facilities by National Instruments. Our chapter leadership, I'm Tiana Chandler, the chapter leader, and we have several of our other chapter members here, chapter leadership members here. Raise your hands if you're on that. If you have any questions about the chapter, you can see any one of us, and we'll be happy to talk more about it. For CPEs, this is eligible for 1 hour, but the way I have it right now is that I would just prefer to have you email me if you would like to have a certificate. So please do so if you would like to have that. Some of our chapter information, memberships, there is individual memberships as well as corporate and student memberships. You go to austin.owasp.org, you can find out more information there. You do not have to be a member to attend this meeting, but we certainly appreciate that to support the community. And speaking of support, volunteer opportunities, if you're interested in helping out with the leadership, if you're wanting to have be able to be a speaker at some of these events, just let us know. If you shop with Amazon, the Amazon Smile, if you designate OWASP, a portion of your purchase would go towards OWASP. We have a study group going on right now. We're reviewing the Black Hat Python book. Matt Pardo, I'm not sure if he's here today. He's leading that as our education coordinator. Please contact him if you want to have more information about that. Some conferences upcoming. Just a note that B-Sides Austin is coming up May 4th and 5th. Other upcoming chapter events. For B-Sides. Yes, registration is required for B-Sides. They're not having any walk-ups. So if you're wanting to attend that, I would suggest you register as soon as possible. For OWASP Austin training, Matt Pardo is still looking at some other opportunities for offering some other training, so just stay tuned for that. Also, the Austin Security Professionals Happy Hour is going to be actually next week, Thursday, instead of the second Thursday of the month. We're having that actually coincide with the InfoSec Southwest ISSW. Other upcoming local events, these are just things that I've picked up off the different calendars. If there's any people that are involved with these groups, let me know if there's any corrections needed, or if you have any other announcements for other events locally.
Okay, at TAG, which meets up at the Tech Ranch, we have Peter Kirby, who's the CEO of Factum, a blockchain technology company. It's at it's this Friday at 7 a.m. Sorry, but 7 a.m. Go to tagaustin.org.
Thank you. Anybody else? Again, for more chapter information, austin.owasp.org. You can find out more information. And now I'd like to present Derek Weeks, who is our presenter today.
Show main screen. No, we're not showing the right screen. You guys don't want to see the speaker view. I think we need to. Let's show my screen. No, you're seeing that. What if we do? Is it? Oh, sorry, technical difficulty.
Bring your screen back up.
Yeah.
Where you had it before. Screen. What it is, this is your primary machine. And you swap the screen. There's an icon up there they were telling you about. You have to swap screen.
Oh, I wasn't looking at that.
That's okay.
Okay.
Share your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Go ahead and
you want. Okay. Now, if I go to the next slide, can you see that? Doesn't want my. Okay. I think we're ready to go. Hey, everyone. So I came down from D.C. last night and am happy to be back in Austin. I lived here about a decade ago for a couple of years and absolutely love it. And, of course, you have the best weather in the world right now. And I even enjoy the really hot stuff midsummer. I do not enjoy the cedar pollen when that's out. So I'm glad I wasn't here in February. So I am the Vice President and DevOps advocate at Sonatype. And part of what I have to share with you today is really exciting from my standpoint of something that I've been working on, some research that I've been working on for the last 3 years. I'm going to share some of the most updated data with you that we have that we will be publishing as part of our 2017 State of the Software Supply Chain report that will be out hopefully in June, and part of the DevSecOps community survey that I just completed, and we just started to launch out and share with everyone the results just last week, I think. So you're getting the freshest data that I have access to at the moment, and it should start for or prepare us for a good conversation. So the conversation today really works around taking some lessons learned from Detroit and Edwards W. Deming and lessons that he taught to the automakers about 3 decades ago. In 1982, in Detroit, there were 4 million cars that rolled off the production lines in the city of Detroit. It's about 15,000 cars every day. And line workers like this were responsible for making sure that as many cars as possible rolled off those production lines. They were incented almost purely on velocity. It is a matter of we have to ship the cars and get them to the market as quickly as possible. If we happen to have the wrong brake assembly to go on this particular vehicle coming down the line, put it on the car, we will fix it later, right? If it means shipping the car out to the lot and we'll fix it later there, we will do that. The focus on velocity and the numbers and the volume was critical to the large automakers. But from 1962 to 1982, the automakers had a big challenge. The Japanese share of autos in the U.S. went from 5% to 25% in those 20 years, because the Japanese were taking lessons from W. Edwards Deming to say, you can't just focus on producing products, you have to produce the best quality products. And by producing the best quality products, you'll have happier customers and also safer customers within your community. So part of what I'm going to share with you today is some of the research that actually aligns to some of the practices that Deming had talked about 30 years ago. And one of the findings in this book, if you haven't read it, it's not a security book. And in fact, it's a pretty intense academic-focused view of the manufacturing industry and kind of what went on in it. But there are a lot of lessons that we can learn within software development and security today, and especially in the DevOps community, where practices are moving and focused a lot on velocity, but those that are doing it best are focusing on quality at the same time. And Deming was talking about you can't inspect quality into the product. And he argued to the Detroit automakers, right, you can't have that line worker that I showed in the last slide inspecting for quality. At that point, it's too late. If the brake assembly doesn't work or has some kind of defect, the line worker can do nothing about it. Those parts have been ordered. Those parts are on the shelf in the warehouse and going onto vehicles that are planning to leave the factory to meet the demand out in the marketplace. It is much too late to inspect on the production line or toward the end of the production line to improve that quality. This is a critical lesson learned for the security community. Is one of the things that we found in the DevSecOps community survey that we just ran in February, we had almost 2,300 people participate in that survey. And one of the things that we found through the survey results is that application security professionals, and many of you that are all in application security or InfoSec-related roles understand, is you're totally outnumbered. And you're totally outnumbered on a couple of fronts. One is there are about 100 developers for every security professional out there within your organization. Our survey shows it, kind of everyone in the industry kind of feels it in one way or another, that there is a lot of work that's happening in software development to get new products and new features to market, and you're the ones that are often left responsible for ensuring the quality and security quality of that application. We're going to talk about in the infrastructure, and we're going to talk specifically about how being outnumbered plays into your role with some numbers that I have from the report. The aim of this conversation today is to provide you a lot of information that may be new to you that you can bring back to your organization and use to start a conversation. So all of you today, I'll show you how to, I'll get a copy of the slides available immediately after the presentation. But one of the things that's happening in my role that I certainly see out in the market is a lot of people that I talk to are working in the DevOps community. And that DevOps community is trying to figure out how can I produce software better and faster than all of my competition, because whoever builds the best software the fastest will win in this market, will totally disrupt the traditional markets that we've seen. And we see that time and again throughout the market. And as part of doing this, companies, in order to meet those time to market, and developers, in order to meet the time to market requirements, are not coding from scratch anymore. In fact, 80% to 90% of what goes into an application now is open source components or packages that those developers are pulling down from the internet. Because why would you ever code from scratch what you could pull from the internet in half a second that someone else developed for you and brought into the organization? That 80 to 90% of the code in an application that is these open source components or packages also kind of relates to your environment in terms of things coming into your environment from outside that no one wanted to build for themselves from scratch, like containers, right? And we'll go into kind of the volume of containers that are coming into or being absorbed into your organization that you fall on having a responsibility of protecting and securing, or that you can work with your development teams to do. So one of the other things that I found interesting in this book as I was reading it over the Christmas break was that Deming was talking about the Japanese manufacturers were not building their own parts in 1982. In fact, they were sourcing about 80% of the parts that they needed for their vehicles from the third-party suppliers within their network. By comparison, Detroit was owning and building 80% of the vehicles themselves. They were only outsourcing the development of parts to a couple of select suppliers. But the parallel today to the Japanese figuring out that 80% of the vehicles that needed to be assembled, or 80% of the parts that they needed to assemble their vehicles, would come from the very best suppliers that figured out how to make those parts better and of higher quality than anyone else in the market. They didn't have to own that. They just had to own the responsibility to assess the best parts coming into their factories up front. So when we look at some of the best practices that Deming brought to the auto suppliers, there were a couple of things that he introduced that were critical to them that also apply to how we develop software today. And that is, you need to use absolutely the best and highest quality parts that you can find within the market. You need to source those from the best suppliers in the market that have the best track record of producing high quality parts. And with whatever parts you use within your manufacturing process, whether you're manufacturing vehicles or you're manufacturing software or assembling software, right, you need to track and trace those components over time, because when something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, you need to know where those parts are so that you can fix and remediate those issues within your environment. So the secret about these open source and third-party components that are being used, or containers that are being used out in the market, is that not all parts are created equal. So part of my role, I said that I'm from Sonatype. Who here knows who Sonatype is? About 30% of you, right? It's okay to be honest. Not a lot of people have heard of Sonatype. If you're a Java developer, probably even haven't heard of Sonatype, but you use our products like Nexus if you're a Java developer, or other development teams use our products. I'll tell you why Sonatype is important. Sonatype plays a role in the market in terms of open source software development. Sonatype runs something called Maven Central. We call it the Central Repository. Maven Central is the old name. This is the largest warehouse of open source components available to Java developers on the planet. We have 1.8 million different components, including all the versions of those components that are available in this warehouse. If you've heard of the NuGet Gallery or rubygems.org or python.pypi.org, these are all large warehouses of open source components that are serving the development community worldwide. We understand who all the open source projects are that are supplying these parts, and the quality of those parts, and the frequency of their contributions, and we understand what organizations globally are consuming those parts. And what I'm going to share to you with you today is insight from the central repository as well as these other repositories on what's really happening out there. So you can get an idea of the volume of what's going on within this market. And the goal of this conversation is really to make the invisible visible. This is something James Wickett, for those of you that know him, was talking to me at a conference about a couple of years ago. It's when I came to Sonatype and I found out what data that we had available about what was happening, I knew that we had to share it. Because if we could share it, we could make people more aware of what was going on, and then the community at large can do something about helping to fix or perhaps better manage what was going on within the environment. So the central repository that we manage, it's a non-commercial side of our business. We keep it up and running, and people download software all day, every day of the year globally. But it represents a software supply chain. A software supply chain works or represents part of a software supply chain. A software supply chain is very easy to understand when you compare it to supply chains in other industries like manufacturing. We have open source projects that are the suppliers. These are the people or groups of organizations that are building the parts. We have central warehouses that house the parts that those suppliers make and make them available to any manufacturer on the planet. The manufacturers are the software development teams, and they are building finished goods or the software applications from these parts and components. To give you an idea of how big and vast these software supply chains are, these are numbers that, even though I've seen them for 3 years, kind of still blow my mind anytime that I talk about them. There is a site out there called modulecounts.com that just keeps track of how many components, binaries, open source packages are available out there across the different development languages. So we did an analysis of their data, and we found out that every single day, 1,000 new open source projects come online globally. Across all open source projects globally, 10,000 new versions of their software is released every day on average. When we looked across all of the open source projects within Maven Central last year, there were 384,000 projects that I looked at. Those projects released on average 14 new versions of their software every year. The amount of supply that is available to developers that would rather assemble parts that they don't have to write from scratch is massive, and it's growing across different languages at a tremendous rate. This also goes for, there's a tremendous rate of not only components being served from open source components, but from Docker containers, right? Docker containers work in the same way. Someone, somewhere, created an application or a set of applications that they wanted to package up in a container and put on Docker Hub. And there are official container sites on there for our applications at Sonatype and any of your organization's applications that might be up there. But any Joe can put, or Jane can put an application up on Docker Hub and make it freely available for anyone to download and consume into their organization. There are the suppliers. Docker Hub is one example of a warehouse. There are the consuming organizations as the software development or operations teams that are consuming those. To give you a sense of the volume, these are new numbers since I was here presenting in LastCon, or at least new for this year. These are the component download requests annually from the Maven Central repository. When I started at Sonatype 3 years ago, we had just done 13 billion download requests from the repository. Last year, we had 52 billion download requests for the open source component. This is only Java components. There are only 10 million Java developers on the planet. Right? 3 years ago, there were probably about 10 million Java developers on the planet. And 3 years before that, there were probably about 10 million Java developers on the planet. The number of Java developers is not skyrocketing along with the use of open source components. It's simply the more awareness and the more parts that are available, the easier it is for organizations to consume these components. This is part of what we revealed in the State of the Software Supply Chain report. This is some of that data, and I'm going to share with you some of the new data that we're beginning to collect around the ecosystem. So there's NPM is the package type for JavaScript. If you have JavaScript, you want to package that up, share it with someone on npm.js.org, you can do so as an open source project. So they hit, I think this was back in November-ish, they hit 52 billion download requests or so that they were aiming at on an annual basis. I believe they had their, it was their first billion download week, I want to say back in August of last year. When I was talking to them in late November, early December, they had just had their first 1.6 billion download week. Right? JavaScript, the amount of JavaScript that is being packaged up and shared among developers globally is unbelievable. And I'm sure the numbers will keep going up, but these numbers are not at a point where we're seeing any level off, because there's a lot of developers that want to use this and a lot of automation that's also picking up these components and pulling them into their product. In mid-February, Donald Stuff works for the Python organization. They support pypi.python.org and keep that repository up and running. So they serve 4.4 billion requests of content in Python. He was saying in 1 month they had done 662 million downloads from python.pypi.org. I don't know how many Python developers there are on the planet. I'm just going to ballpark that there are fewer than Java developers, but I have no idea. I should find somewhere to look up that data. No, 123. Actually, I'm one of those, so 122, because I am not a Python developer. So part of it, when you look at the volume of what's being consumed, you also have to think about, okay, if this is consumed, where did it come from? What does it include? What is in that code? And what did we put in our software? So as I mentioned before, not all parts are created equal. So when I looked at all of the downloads over the last 3 years that I've been producing this report, and this is the latest numbers that will go into the 2017 report that we'll publish in June-ish. So this says about 1 in 18 of the downloads from Maven Central had a known security vulnerability in them on day 1 of download. Right? Out of all the downloads that are happening today, that happened yesterday, about 1 in 18 or so have a security vulnerability in them from the start. There's nothing that tells a developer, in any of these repositories, Maven Central or Pythons or NPM, hey, there's a vulnerability in this version. You're using the same version that you used yesterday, that you used last year, that you used 8 or 10 years ago because it works and that's what you've always used, and that's what I'm bringing in with my build tool, right? That's the piece that I need, that I want to use. But I'll tell you, none of you work in an organization that downloaded 1 billion components last year. The biggest I've seen from any private organization annually is about 16 million components. That 16 million components comes from a company in the healthcare industry. Right? And we'll get to maybe some details around that. I think, well, actually, if I remember last year when I was talking about them, 16 million downloads, 778,000 were known vulnerable when they downloaded them. Right? They're only helping with build software for healthcare-related purposes, so none of you should worry. Yes? Question? I said nothing of the developers released it. I just said, but we'll get to that, so it's a good question. This is just you downloaded it in that component, so you download Struts, Core 2.3, and Struts Core 2.3 has had a known CVE on it for the last 5 years. The CVE is published. It's on the National Vulnerability Database or some other source. It is known vulnerable today. Those vulnerable versions and non-vulnerable versions are all available. Nothing gets removed from the repositories once it's placed in. At the time of download, yes, at the time of download, there was a known vulnerability in that component. So the average organization, when I looked across 3,000 organizations, was downloading 229,000 Java components annually. Of those components, if you stripped out all of the duplicate downloads, you would have about 5,200 downloads of unique components across all versions. If you stripped out all the versions and you said, what if I just wanted the best version of each of those components that I was sourcing, you would need just over 2,000 different components. This does not include how many unique logging frameworks or web application frameworks may you have downloaded in your organization. That would reduce the number even further. But what this plays into is, how many suppliers am I using? About 2,000 suppliers. The average company is using about 2,000 suppliers. They are using about 5,000 parts, unique parts from those suppliers. And they're downloading them about 100, each of those parts or suppliers' parts about 100 times. So the interesting thing about this is when you go back to the Deming principles and you say, we're going to use the very best parts from the very best suppliers, that would mean you could effectively download 2,000 parts, share those across your Java development organization in this case, And that's all you would need to do. You could store those locally. You could maintain them in a golden repository if you wanted and say, these are the parts and these are the best parts that we've selected. And if you remove the number of parts that had known vulnerabilities in them, you could even clean the well, if you will, or clean your software supply chain a little more through that kind of practice. That may get on to questions that we have as we move forward. If you do have any questions, feel free to ask. There's lots of information to go through, but I'm happy to answer any questions along the way. So of these 229,000, almost 7.5% had known vulnerabilities across those 3,000 organizations that I looked at. So if you're the average organization, you're bringing in 17,000 vulnerable components a year. The interesting thing from my perspective, and one of the reasons why I share this, is I can ask for a report on almost any large organization around the world to understand what they're downloading from the central repository, and I can get that report and analyze it within about 20 minutes. It is impossible, nearly impossible, for any of you to do that in your organization. Because if you have 500 developers or 50 developers or 2,000 developers, you know how many people you have in procurement? Like 50 or 500 or 2,000, right? To try and audit and analyze that is near impossible. What did all your developers do today, this morning? You want to try and audit that? It's nearly impossible unless you completely restrict and lock down access to these repositories, which some organizations have done. They figured out kind of what the inflow is, and they said, look, this is nuts. We can't protect ourselves. We can't secure ourselves. So they implement, one of the ways to do this is to take a repository manager. They're open source repository managers. We have one. You can get it for free. There are other vendors out there. You can get it for free. You can tell your developers, we only want you accessing and getting components from the local warehouse version of these repository managers. And to do this means you know exactly what's coming in to your organization. From a security standpoint, we make zero money if you download our open source product to do this. But from a practice standpoint, you can have 500 front doors into your organization, or you could have 5, right? And there are organizations that have said, if we're going to protect ourselves, limit the number of front doors. And in fact, by storing the parts that you need in a local repository, it's less time to download it. It's faster for the development teams. It's just-in-time sourcing. Put the parts next to where they're being assembled, right? Everything moves faster. Yes. There are very few companies that are doing that. I'm out spreading the word because it's actually a simple concept, but organizations like, they've said this publicly, so I can say JPMC is one of the organizations that our CEO, it's a story they told publicly, so I'll share it. Our CEO was meeting with their CISO about, it was 3 or 4 years ago now, and he said, hey, do you know who the largest consumer is of open source components globally across the Java ecosystem? And he was like, oh, easy, like it's got to be IBM. He's like, no. He's like, okay, well, it's got to be the federal government. No. Like, it's you. Last year, you downloaded 3.3 million open source components from the central repository, and the CISO said, I had no idea we were doing that. I have no one employed in the bank that looks for anything related to those components. Unknown origin, unknown sources coming into the bank and making their way into our applications. Whether they're secure or not, I have no idea. I had no idea we're consuming that much coming into our organization. And they moved swiftly to lock down their environment. There was another, a pretty well-known bank in New Jersey that I just saw within the last 2 months. About 90% of what they were downloading all went through a repository manager, which said they were trying their best to block what was going in. I think when I looked last year, I'll say under 100 organizations in the world have 80% of what they're downloading go through a repository manager, right? Which says there's a free-for-all and very little control. The control is fairly easy to instrument. It's just a matter of working with development if you want to do that. If you want to talk further, I can talk to you later about that. So you asked the question about, hey, does that mean that the software developers released that component with a known vulnerability into production, right? Just because you downloaded it doesn't mean that you used it, right? So we looked at the downloads, and last year it was 6.1%, or this was 2015. I'll update that to 5.5% this year. We looked at all those downloads. Then we looked in the repository managers. This is the local well of open source components developers had access to. And just over 5.5% of those in the local repository managers had a known vulnerability. When we looked at 25,000 different applications and analyzed the components in them, 6.8% of the components across those applications had at least one known security vulnerability in them. So what that tells me through the analysis is that from the beginning of the software supply chain to the end of the software supply chain, there is not enough vetting or control as to what's coming in and being used within the environment, right? Certain things like you're all in OWASP, you know OWASP dependency check, right? Free open source tool. Sonatype has a free open tool like that can tell you what components are in your applications that you can get a hold of. If you want to know what components are in your application, there are some free tools out there that will allow you to do that. So this is really cool in my world, hopefully in yours too. Northeastern University, this was, I want to say 2 weeks ago now, published a report called Thou Shall Not Depend on Me. You can look on Sonatype's website, or you can just search Thou Shall Not Depend on Me on Google when you get these slides. And it's a very easy paper to find. It's on the white paper section of Sonatype. But what they did, they looked at client-side JAVASCRIPT vulnerability. They looked across 133,000 websites to understand what versions of components of NPM packages were being used within those applications. And they found from handlebars to jQuery to Angular that the percent of websites that had a known vulnerability related to one of those components that was being used. Not only, and this is 15-page paper that they go into excruciating detail on what they found, but they also get into not only were these organizations using jQuery and maybe a vulnerable version of jQuery, but in one site they were using multiple versions of jQuery in the application that they had built for this site. There were multiple versions of the same package that were being used. It's kind of like imagine Ford rolling off new F-150s, and they have 15 different brake assemblies they can use for the 2017 model year. Like you wouldn't do that, but organizations do this on a regular basis where different versions of the same component are being used. And also they found I think it was 5 or 10% of cases, multiple vulnerable versions were also used in those applications. But if you're developing with JavaScript and you want a really good academic research paper, I'd highly recommend it. I liked it. So I mentioned the DevSecOps community survey that we just ran in the month of February. We just released the results. So one of the questions that we had asked 3 years ago when we ran a similar survey was, do you have an open source policy in place in your organization that says you should download or use good parts, not bad parts? And bad parts could be restrictive license types, it could be known security vulnerabilities, it could be outdated components, but this is part of what open source policies are. In the biggest organizations, I don't remember the specific numbers from this survey, but because 57% between the 3 years had open source policies in place, almost 4 in 10 do not have a policy in place for what they're bringing into the organization. In the biggest, most regulated industries like financial services, the number goes up to like the low 70s percentage of organizations that have an open source policy in place. Or, and this is why the survey data is interesting, this is, I go out and ask people, do you have an open source policy in place? Right? Someone says, yes, I'm aware of it, or no, I'm not aware of it. Maybe they do have a policy, but 4 in 10 people either say they don't, or they're simply not aware enough to say yes, which means they don't govern, activity in their lives by any particular rules of what's being brought into the organization. So this is where we have a lot of fun with the data team at Sonatype that helps me dissect different views of the data that we have on the downloads and components that we find in applications. I'll dissect the chart for you. The blue line in the chart shows across the 25,000 applications we looked at, what is the average age of the components by year? So 2-year-old components make up 21% of the application. 4-year-old components make up about 12% of those applications. 9-year-old components make up about 3% of the components in those applications. The red line shows the number of components that had at least one known security vulnerability across that population. So years 1 through 3, about 5% of those components had a known security vulnerability in them. When you get out to 7, 8, 9, 10, nearing 15% of those components have vulnerabilities in them. So we all know security researchers will find more components over time, or more vulnerabilities over time in these components. So of course the younger components would have fewer known discovered vulnerabilities than the older components. That makes logical sense. But when you think about, do we have an open source policy? And does that open source policy say you can use any open source components that you want within your organization, but they better be 3 years or younger? Right? Because if they are, you can use any versions you want, man, just within the last 3 years. You could lower your defect density almost 3 times by that kind of function. I'm not going to restrict any developers from using stuff. I just want them to use better stuff. And yes. No. I'd love to say the components that are younger are of better quality. I just think the known vulnerabilities haven't been discovered yet. So the known exploits and the exploits in the wild are not published yet. So if you're going to have a little more protection on your side, use newer components versus older components. At some point, what's new today will be old in 3 years. So you do need to think about updating them. The other thing, so we also looked at older components components on the latest version. So the blue line says in year 1, 13% of those components that we saw are on the latest version. Remember, there are 14 releases on average a year, so that would make sense. Not every version of year 1 components are on the latest version. In year 5, 14% are on the latest version. In year 9, 20% are on the latest version, right? So quick translation of year 9. Someone developed a piece of software 9 years ago that is being used in an application under active development today. That project has never released a new version of the software, which tells you that's either a perfect piece of code developed in 2008, right, or it's a dead project, right? If there is a known security vulnerability that, 15% of those have known security vulnerabilities, if there's a known vulnerability in those parts, there is no remediation path. You can't move to a newer version. There is none. There hasn't been any for the last 9 years, right? So not only does using newer components make sense from reducing vulnerabilities, it also means that you have better chances of remediating the issues. So there is some new, there is some evidence that people care about what components they're putting into their products or not. Part of that is organizations like OWASP Dependency Check is not that old. It's only 2 years old, 2.5, 3. So, okay. Yeah. So 3 years old, relatively new for someone to say, I have a free open source tool that people can use to inspect what's in their application. Our Nexus repository product has a function in it called repository health check. That repository health check basically tells you in the local warehouse of your parts, do any have known license risk, known security risk, what have you. The blue line is the number of instances of Nexus repository that we can measure out in the market. The yellow line is the number of people that clicked on the button in the product that said, analyze my repository. So that's gone up over the years. It hasn't gone up at the same rate, but it says someone is concerned about what's in the well of components that are feeding my development teams, which is another way to look at what components are we bringing into the organization. So back to the survey, one of the things that we asked this year was, does your organization maintain a complete bill of materials for the open source and third-party components, including dependencies that you're using in your application? So 35% of the people, the 2,300 people that we surveyed, said we're keeping a complete software bill of materials for the applications that we release. We know every component. The average application has about 100 or so components in it. 65% either said we keep it for the core components but not the dependencies, or I'm not aware that we keep a bill of materials whatsoever. When you think about back to the Deming principles of track and trace, right? Think back to Takata airbags, right? How many of you, including me, got a letter in the mail from my auto manufacturer that says, my car has a known vulnerable Takata airbag in it? They know every single make and model of every vehicle shipped across every brand, across every model, across every year that had the known vulnerable Takata airbags in them, right? If they know that, they can track and trace and begin remediation of those defective airbags or defective parts in that vehicle, because manufacturing supply chains are extremely well managed, right? The Jeep Cherokee that the Wired, writers from Wired were driving down the highway that someone hacked into like the week before Black Hat so they could publish the story, right? Jeep or Chrysler was able to recall 1.3 million Jeeps. They knew exactly what versions of software were in what Jeeps, right? Even their software within their supply chain is controlled because they know what's there so they can recall that. When we look at the survey results from this year as well, and this was, so the survey results in this year said 1 in 5 organizations suspected or confirmed that they had a breach related to open source, vulnerable open source components within their organization. When I asked this a couple of years ago in the 2014 survey, it was 14%. So we went from 14 to 20% of organizations confirming or suspecting a breach. Now, when I ran the survey in 2014, you know I ran it? In April of 2014. Anyone know what happened in April of 2014? Heartbleed. Yeah. April 7th. We started the survey on April 1st and ended it on April 30th. April 7th, Heartbleed kind of hit the news, and by April 10th, everyone was talking about it, which boosted the number of people responding in that survey saying, I believe that we had or suspect a breach, which would naturally happen. We didn't have anything like that in February. We had to wait until March when the Struts 2 vulnerability was announced. So here are some numbers that's kind of the fun and scary part of my job. So I've mentioned this before in presentations, but about a year ago, Apple versus the FBI, Apple was complaining that, or the FBI was complaining that Apple put strong cryptography into their iPhones so the FBI couldn't break into it easily. And you can fall on either side of that argument, but anyone know Bouncy Castle? Does anyone know what this component does? What does it do? It's a crypto library, right? And it sits, all versions of Bouncy Castle sit on Maven Central. So when that was going on, I asked our data guys to say, how many downloads were there of Bouncy Castle? And I actually asked them at the beginning of this year, give me the 2016 numbers. So in 2016, there were 23 million downloads of Bouncy Castle across all versions. Bouncy Castle has perfectly safe versions available. When they find a security flaw, they try and immediately pick up and remediate that and introduce a safer version for anyone using their project to use. In terms of suppliers, this is a good supplier, good practice of releasing new non-vulnerable versions, right? So of the 23 million downloads, 11 million were the known vulnerable versions last year. Half of the organization, I'll just say broadly, half of the components, Bouncy Castle versions downloaded were the known vulnerable ones when completely safe versions were available when those developers wanted that component. I think it amounts to something like 13,000 organizations were downloading those. Commons collection, right? Everyone read the Foxglove report in November 2015, so we're about 14, 15 months away from that, the announcement of the Commons collection vulnerabilities. So in 2016, there were 23 million downloads of Commons collection from Maven Central, and 18 million were the known vulnerable versions of Commons collection. Right. Now, if you're going to fix a problem with Commons collection or Bouncy Castle or something, you need the known vulnerable versions to rebuild the original app. This 18 million does not represent a bunch of people rebuilding their original app. I don't know because I didn't interview them, but I'm just going to wager that 18 million is, I'm just going to download whatever versions I need, or maybe it's coming in as a dependency on something else that I'm using, and it's coming in, but they're the known vulnerable versions. Struts 2, the announcement just a couple weeks ago, the CVE 5638. So in 2016, the vulnerable versions of for that announcement that we just had a couple weeks ago, 279,000 downloads across 2,700 organizations brought that in. So when I hear about the Struts vulnerability being announced, right, and people can freak out to different levels within their organization. For those that had to go through a Struts vulnerability, for those at the Canadian Revenue Office, Canadian Statistics, Japanese Post that had to shut down their sites for a number of days a couple of weeks ago to fix this vulnerability. I knew there were only 2,700 organizations, at least from their downloads from last year, that were impacted by that, right? So you can see, or I get to see, and I get to share this because I want people to understand what's the volume of consumption happening out there. When I talked about earlier about, hey, as security professionals, you're outnumbered 100 to 1 by developers. When you understand the component downloads and what's coming into your organization from open source across different languages, or what might be in the containers, that hopefully I'll get some more specific container information about what's being brought into your organization, this is an area that you have to understand, and you have to try and begin to assess through conversations in your organization, what can I do about this? And if you're so inclined within the security community to think about how are we going to solve these kind of issues for the community at large, where Sonatype has commercial-related solutions that apply to this, we're not going to solve every problem out there. We're not the end-all, be-all solution to this problem. It's bigger than us. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So what have you guys experienced as successful ways to communicate this issue such that the decision maker will decide this is the way we want them to decide? Versus that's just continually pushing from our side, which, there are a number of things we can be pushing on that are issues or hot topics. Why should they what's a good argument for that you guys are not successful? Why should you care about this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. What kind of arguments actually work? And it kind of depends who you're talking to, whether you're talking to a security team that is potentially overloaded with work on evaluations coming through, a governance team that may have or be setting up the rules for governing these within the organizations, or development teams that don't like the rework that they get from security teams. So from a security team, well, let me start with the governance teams maybe. So the groups of the organizations that set up the rules about what can we bring into the organization, what can't we bring into the organization. There are rules set up, most likely on paper today, about what's good or what's bad. And that governance group should, in practice, have legal people because there are licenses associated with every one of these components. Note, if it does not have a license, the license is actually the license to use. If there's no license for it, you have no legal right to use it. You're breaking copyright law by bringing those in. From a security perspective, there should be security practitioners on those teams. And part of it is, and I've been in organizations where they said, look, we want to evaluate and keep our software safe. We want to know what's in these applications. And we can manually evaluate these, but the real solution is you have to find a way to automate the analysis of what's coming in. And you go from, let's hire I was meeting with a very large insurance company that said, we're going to have to hire our business case was, hire a whole building of people to evaluate the applications that we're building, right? Because it takes a couple of weeks or a number of hours for small applications, a couple of weeks for big applications to analyze what's in them and to keep up with that continuously. Or we can find a way to establish the rules within our governance group, including security, on what's acceptable and what's not, and automate that evaluation or analysis of what's coming in. So security works on setting up the rules for what's acceptable and then working with technologies that can automate the evaluation of these things against those rules. Because there's no way, you can't keep up with 229,000 downloads, or 10,000 downloads to try and evaluate those in your organization. Yeah. 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 So it's a good point about the flow of components, right? There are suppliers like Sonatype or npm.org or rubygems.org that we house these components for everyone. So why don't we just prevent and stop those downloads from happening, right? If we know they're known vulnerable. One is if you need to remediate that component and put in a newer version, you need the original component available to you to rebuild the original app and then replace the vulnerable part. So that's one reason we can't do it. The other one, if you're not familiar with NPM Gate, Google NPM Gate. And you'll see what happens when one developer, this is totally unrelated to security, right, was being sued by someone and they said, you named a component Kik, and we own the company Kik, K-I-K, so we're going to sue you unless you rename your component. And the developer kind of gave the finger virtually to the lawyer that was contacting him and said, okay, screw all of you. I'm just going to remove my NPM packages from npmjs.org. And when he did that, about 10,000 builds globally broke in about 30 minutes. Because that 14 lines of code that he had packaged up to reuse was used by all of those organizations pulling those billions of download requests, and it broke. And interesting case study, go and read it. But when that broke, the developer said, no, I'm not giving you the part back, it's mine. And someone in the world said, I have a version of that 14 lines of code, put it back. And who knows what verification happened to say, I've got the code you need. I called it Kik and just put it back in the repo. And everyone can use that code. It's okay. I'm not going to get into I can think of a lot of things to say around that. So part of this has been up here for a while. I'm sure you've read it. So the liability is a big issue. Josh Corman and others within the industry are talking about if you manufacture a vehicle, food products, pharmaceuticals, whatever, and you place known defective ingredients or parts in those products, and you sell them to someone, you are liable, right? The same should hold true. The argument is the same should hold true for software that you're developing and selling. And the federal government is taking aim at a number of different places, and the software supply chain report from last year points to Underwriters Laboratory, FSISEC, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, American Bankers Association, if I didn't mention a number of organizations that are saying you have to know what's in the software. We don't want the FDA, right? We don't want you selling products to us or to consumers that have known vulnerabilities within them. Just quickly, we're like almost out of time. So I'll say there's information in the survey on containers. People, 88% are concerned on security of containers, but only 53% have tools that can actually help them identify those issues. This is really quick. When we looked at where security was being automated across the development lifecycle, the blue lines, compared to the purple lines, which is mature DevOps organizations automating security, today the numbers over 3 years went up 2 to 3-fold where security is being automated. I won't go into information about the screens, but if you want a software bill of materials similar to the dependency check, you can find one at that bit.ly URL. And if you want the community survey or the software supply chain report, my out-of-office message is on. If you email me and you don't need to put, hello, Derek, thanks for your presentation, any of that. If you email me, you'll get my out-of-office message. There's a link to these slides, the software supply chain report and the community survey report. You don't have to register or anything. They're just on SlideShare. My out-of-office is on all day. And thank you.
Thank you very much. And so we're out of time. So thanks, everybody, for coming, and have a great day.